I'd like to start with you, if that's okay. I share many of the concerns that have been expressed by colleagues that self-preferencing by dominant digital platforms may, in some circumstances, harm competition. But I'm also concerned that the broad, vague language used in ICOA could actually prohibit some conduct that's pro-competitive as well. Do you share this concern? And if so, can you elaborate?
Very much, Senator. So the bill makes central, as a limiting principle, the concept of harm to competition. And that's going to mean one of two things: either antitrust-style consumer welfare or injury to rivals or competitors. And the bill inexplicably leaves that vacant. Professor Scott Morton is exactly right. Antitrust does have a concept of competitive harm, not exactly the statutory language that ICOA has chosen, but consumer welfare, the use of market power to make consumers or trading partners or workers worse off overall. It's a harm requirement. And if ICOA said that, then my written testimony would have been much shorter and my concerns would have been allayed, but it doesn't. It could just mean injury to competitors, and that's what creates these terrible dangers.
Thank you. That's helpful. Professor Kanjub, as I've mentioned, censorship isn't necessarily itself an antitrust problem, but market power can certainly enable, and in some cases markedly exacerbate, censorship. And I think that we need to deal with the censorship issue head-on its own terms, which is why I'm preparing to introduce legislation that would prevent social media companies from acting as censor in private communications between one person and another, and would require them to be transparent and offer due process to their users when moderating public content, while still allowing for the removal of illegal and pornographic content. Do you believe such a bill would be helpful?
Very much, Senator. As noted, OAMA doesn't really directly address the issue of deplatforming individuals. You could sort of read into it in one of the sections that it perhaps provides some protection, but it doesn't have direct language saying that the platform shall not engage in unreasonable discrimination. Similarly, ICOA protects business users, but not user users. So I think that legislation that sets that forth would be a real step forward and would help Americans.
Okay, let's go back to ICOA for a minute. Professor Francis, ICOA supporters have pointed out, they'll point to the requirement that in many sections, conduct has to result in harm to competition. Does this alleviate any of your concerns?
It doesn't, Senator, and I think there's a real risk that a court looking at this bill will say, gosh, it's pretty clear that this was intended to signal a departure from the antitrust standard. Number one, this conversation is being had right now as part of the legislative process, and so failing to answer that pretty strongly suggests that there isn't a clear answer that can be written into the bill. This is not itself going to be an antitrust statute. It doesn't use antitrust statutory language. So Section 7 of the Clayton Act, for example, talks about a merger being illegal if its effect may be substantially to lessen competition. That's not language that's followed here. And there's nothing in ICOA that says harm to competition shall be interpreted compatibly with antitrust. So this looks like a different kind of bill doing different kind of work that very intentionally is going a different way from traditional antitrust, including because of political and other concerns about antitrust's consumer welfare standard itself. So I think failing to answer that question on the face of the bill is very dangerous.
Oh, so by leaving these important terms vague and undefined, are they giving the game away? Giving the game away in that this would end up being a bill about protecting competitors, not competition or not consumers, right?
I don't think there can be any room for doubt that if harm to competition in this statute is read to mean injury to rivals or injury to competitors, it would be terribly anti-consumer in its operation.
And can that be remedied without an adequate narrowing of the term, eliminating the vagueness in the terminology?
I can't think of an alternative, Senator, to saying, and it's a short and simple provision if this is really the purpose of the measure, to say that harm to competition means injury to consumer welfare, or I'm not wedded to the terminology if something else like overall harm to consumers and workers, but something that incorporates the concept, I think is critical to ensure that it doesn't do a terrible amount of unintended harm.
And yet this concept is not foreign to our competition policy. It's not foreign to antitrust law. This is pretty well-worn stuff, right?
Exactly as Professor Scott Morton says, that's what antitrust typically means when it says harm to competition. Now, it can be hard in some cases to figure out whether a harmful static effect like a price increase can really be outbalanced by a beneficial dynamic benefit like greater innovation. So there can be difficulties in applying it, but everybody understands in antitrust that we're concerned with overall consumer welfare effects. And that's the question that's going to be asked of this statute.
Thank you. See, my time has expired. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Senator Lee. Next up is Senator Durbin, our chair. Thank you for being here.
Thanks, Madam Chairman. Senator Klobuchar, I want to thank you and